tell us, this wasn't authorized by Congress. So how did this suddenly come to life, and how was it funded?
Well, it was funded out of, so the Secretary of the Navy, who was a journalist, Josephus Daniels, had a real need to manage censorship because the Navy was in charge of wireless and they therefore cable as well. So he had a real need to solve this problem. There were a lot of other people, including Walter Lippmann, I might add, who wanted to be propagandists and actually wanted to head such an agency. But Creel was very aggressive at getting this job and convinced Daniels that he was the man. He had written some very favorable articles about Daniels. And Daniels went to Wilson and said, we have to do something. And Wilson immediately said, this is fine, we'll hire Creel. Wilson paid him out of his war fund, which Congress had given him. So there was no accountability for the money. And in fact, that was a big problem and a big mistake in the end, because that Congress was mad anyway, because they saw it as a propaganda agency for Wilson himself. And because they had no control, until the very end, they had no control at all. In the very final months, they got some control. But in that sense, it actually, if we look back on it, it was unconstitutional. There was no, Creel's appointment was done by Wilson without any congressional involvement. The budget was put together by Creel and Wilson without any congressional budget. And that's a bad way to run propaganda from a Democratic point of view. It's a good way for the president. Does that answer the question?
Yes. And this is the same guy whose family owned the Raleigh News and Observer for a long, long time, right?
Right. He was a very famous journalist and a big operative in the Democratic Party, right? And his family owned it, the paper until very recently. Absolutely.
Yeah, until the Knights Ritter chain bought it, I think.
Right.
So what surprised you the most while you were doing all this research?
Well, there's a lot that surprised me. I'll give you two quick ones. One is one I was going to mention in the conversation here. One was that I became very curious about Wilson's slogan in his 1916 campaign, which was, he kept us out of war. And it occurred to me that that may have been cynical on his part, because of course, as soon as he was inaugurated, inauguration in those days was in March, and within a couple of weeks after being inaugurated, we went to war. I came to see that wasn't true, but what I did learn by going through all the records of the Democratic National Committee is that the Democratic National Committee's Publicity Bureau, which was the best publicity bureau in any campaign in the history of our country up to that time, because it was brilliantly and creatively run, was a test kitchen for what the CPI would be. And in fact, Creel was the number 2 person in that committee. Many of the techniques and many of the people who found themselves into the CPI came from the DNC. This is important not only because it tells you something about the history, but it reveals something very important about how presidents propagandize. We often talk about the fact that you campaign one way and you govern another. But in fact, or what you say when you campaign is not the same thing as what you do when you govern. But in fact, the way you campaign is very reflective of the way you govern. Start with Donald Trump. He tweeted his way in large part into the presidency and continued tweeting when he was there. Barack Obama used social media to get elected. And then as soon as he was in the White House, he creates a huge unit, bigger than the press office, for social media. John F. Kennedy was very good at television and used it effectively when he was president. So this is a pattern that we see all throughout the 20th century. The second thing that surprised me, and I'm thinking I may do a second book that deals just with this, is the extent to which the press became deeply involved with government during this period. In many cases, journalists just did this openly. And I'll give you a quote here from the head of the AP, who said, as soon as the United States went to war, he said, the AP had observed very strictly neutrality on all controversial points due to the many points of view of its members. Today, thank God, this is not necessary. But now the contrary is true, for there will be no trace of neutrality coursing through our veins. Give you another example, which is one that I stumbled on, which is stunning, actually. The Columbia School of Journalism, in its second year of Pulitzer Prizes, gave one for a pamphlet that was written that called attention to the instruction that was provided to journalists during the present national emergency. And this pamphlet extolled the fact that journalists had publicized government programs and satisfied the unprecedented need for many specific concealments and for suppression of ill-timed sentiments. In other words, they got a Pulitzer Prize for not doing their job.
Wow.
That's something that would never be said today, of course, at all. So there was this obvious this obvious partisanship, but there's a whole nother level here. And that was that many journalists ended up working behind the scenes for the CPI, or for the Wilson administration. Many journalists actually worked, many journalists worked publicly for the CPI, and you knew they were journalists and you could see what they were doing in many cases. But there were many journalists who worked on propaganda, sometimes at the behest of the CPI, but out of sight. There's a hero in this story, somebody who's been completely forgotten and deserves to be remembered. It's a guy named Arthur Bullard, who was a fabulous journalist who died young and was went to Russia. He was an expert on Russia and had been there even in the 1905 revolution in Russia. Went to Russia, did some journalism, went to work for the CPI, and then wrote some propaganda that is the best propaganda I think I've ever read put out by the United States. It was honest. It was reflective about what was the shortcomings in the American experience, and it looked for ways to try to find common ground. He was eventually had to leave. The CPI was thrown out, and the great diplomat historian George Kennan said that his loss was the biggest loss of any loss they could have had in Russia at that time. The other person who worked behind the scenes and remained a journalist during that whole time, there's many, but I'm going to give you one, is Karl Ackerman. He's well remembered because he was a very, accomplished journalist, foreign correspondent at his time. But he went on to be the first dean of the Columbia School of Journalism when they got a dean in the 1920s. And I will just read you one quote from a letter to Colonel House. And this was before he was about to go to Switzerland. And he said, "My object is to be of service to you and the Department of State first." He went to countries where the Department of State and where House thought he could be most effective in doing propaganda. He worked undercover. When he worked for the Saturday Evening Post, the Saturday Evening Post knew he was doing this. And at one point, they wanted to actually install him permanently there, working with the embassy, the legation. And he was working for the New York Times at the time. And the New York Times said it would be fine for him to pretend to be a New York Times reporter while he worked for the government. So you look at this, you say, really? How could this be? But it was a very pervasive mentality. We can go into why if you want to later. But we think of the CIA involvement with journalists during the Cold War as being that moment when a great deal of disillusionment set in, and the Vietnam War also set in a moment of disillusionment about journalism, but also a moment where the press became disillusioned with government. Well, I think the disillusioning moment, the first one, is really World War I, because after the war was over, many people who had been propagandists began to see that there was something wrong with what had happened, and it created a cynicism about government. And that cynicism was very pervasive. Here's a guy who's also forgotten. He won a Pulitzer Prize, actually, one of the first Pulitzer Prizes. His name was Ernest Poole, and he worked for the CPI. He was in charge of their foreign news operation. And he wrote a novel after the war called Blind, The Story of Our Times. And here's a quote from what he said: "Washington has been invaded by an army of ideas, a host of strange new aims and methods born in the clash and din abroad, and now entering here to bore and burrow their devices, the devious ways deep into our national institutions. We are being driven to drastic powers of control over the whole nation's life." And that was a CPI member who wrote that after the war. There were many more like him. And another one who is very famous and well remembered, of course, is Walter Lippmann. We don't remember that he wanted to be a propagandist and ended up actually being one with the American Expeditionary Force. But of course, then wrote a book called Public Opinion, and two others, as a matter of fact, in which he said it's no longer possible to believe in the original dogmas of democracy. So I'm going to go on to one other point. I'll make it very quick. We now have some laws that govern what presidents can do with information, but they're inadequate, almost meaningless in many cases. They're rarely applied. Of course, the reason they can't be applied is partly because the apparatus to apply them is under the aegis of the White House. Justice Department works for the White House. And so there's quite a lot of law. I can go into this quite a great deal of length at length if you want. But the point I want to make is still remains a very real problem. And it's a particularly big problem today because technology, the techniques are the same as what the CBI did, but the technology gives the president and the White House much more power than it had. But in addition to that, the number of journalists covering Washington has decreased. So the balance of power has changed in a way that's very unwholesome, I think, for our nation. And people don't focus on this enough. And it's one of the reasons I wrote this book. There's a real story to tell here about how we need to fence back the power of chief executives to use our money to tell us what to think.